Hey everyone. Today I'm joined by Patrick Barry. Uh, Patrick is someone I've been talking to for a little bit offline, but we've been having some fascinating conversations and thought that we'd record them and bring it into some of the conversation space. Patrick has an education primarily in science, degree in environmental science, master's in science journalism. He's currently a software engineer for the Waking Up Meditation app by Sam Harris. But before that, he worked for 10 years as a science journalist, covering everything from biotech to molecular biology to quantum physics and cosmology, which is really cool. So we'll be getting into some of that. But the main centering thing for this conversation will be around Patrick's engagement with the Stoicism community. Patrick has studied Stoicism for the last 5 years, started a Stoa in San Francisco that ran for a year and a half, and currently running one in Pittsburgh. He gave a lightning talk to StoaCon 2023 about the quote meta lesson of Stoicism, what we can learn from the kind of tradition that ancient Stoicism was, and why it fills an important gap in our modern society, which again is something I want to dive into. As I said, yeah, we've been kind of talking offline for a little bit, and thought it'd be great to start recording some of these chats and try to bridge some communities here, because Patrick is interested in sort of how these discussions help kind of contribute to the founding of new communities, wisdom gyms that kind of help fill the gap left by the decline of traditional religions, but with a reality-based, rational, and quote woo-free place for cultivating greater wisdom and connection. So that's enough of a setup for now. But thank you very much, Patrick. I've been really looking forward to talking to you on the podcast.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome. Yeah. So some more context, I guess. Yeah, we've been talking for a little bit, and I've been really encouraged and fascinated by our conversations. There's a lot of overlap, and yet at the same time, you're kind of coming from sort of a different place than a lot of other people from the current metamodern community, which is cultural studies folks and people from the integral scene, spiral dynamics, all this stuff. And you're bringing a kind of stoicism and secular spirituality, secular Buddhist kind of background into this. And part of the thing I've been excited to touch base on is, well, one, trying to bridge some of these communities, thread them together, network them, but also talk about what this kind of thing means. Like, why Stoicism? Why this sort of contemporary resurgence of lived philosophy and the kind of potentials of secular spirituality, because one of the things we discussed in the past was seeing in spiritual spaces and meaning making spaces this kind of proclivity towards a certain kind of woo factor, a certain kind of bringing in things that are maybe outside the more naturalistic frames. And one of the things I feel like we kind of bonded over was this connection to a very grounded, naturalistic, science-friendly spirituality and sense of meaning.
Mhm.
So as setup, I don't know, anywhere into this conversation you feel like would be a good way in to kind of yeah, bring in some of these threads, explain maybe a little bit what you see these connections are, and anything really about your experience with these things.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. Those take at least 1 hour. Um, but yeah, it is interesting that you and I have sort of arrived at such kind of I want to be complimentary might be putting it too weakly, like very much in a very similar place in terms of what interests us and where we see this going, given that I come at it from a science background and you come at it from a religious studies and more of a liberal arts kind of background, social theory and that sort of thing. But that we've sort of converged on, I think, something that's highly overlapping at least.
Yeah.
And and so for me, I mean, the interest in Stoicism, and I take Stoicism, just to be clear, as kind of a starting point, not as a thing to slavishly follow in any kind
Hmm.
of a way, but just I feel like they have the right idea about several things, and that we can take and move forward and integrate into a more modern context. One of which is, the sort of three pillars of Stoicism are like physics, ethics, and logic. And they meant logic to mean, critical thinking, clear thinking, lack of being deceived, especially by yourself, in general. And, it's hard to argue for not, it's hard to argue against that,
Mm.
really. Um, but taking that as a foundational and sort of necessary part of I mean, I consider Stoicism to be a spiritual practice, in the kind of reality based, grounded sort of way. Spirituality without spirits, I guess. And here's to say quickly before, if that offends anybody, I think a true Stoic and a true sort of empiricist would be open to acknowledging the existence of any of those things if sufficient evidence came to
Mm,
light. Right, it's not like closing the door on anything. It's just, what do we know with some sort of real intellectual honesty and clarity about what do we actually know and what do we not know, and just letting the things we don't know lie for now.
mm.
And we will, if we can know those better in the future, great. But until then, we just have to just label it with the I don't know sticker,
Well,
and
let's. I want to bring some things out of that because that's already
yeah.
there's a lot going on. As you said, yes,
Mhm.
immediately an hour's worth of conversation here. But
Yes.
to get us started, well, so yes, so that's also something that I'm very passionate about, and I think there's some confusion there. Is that in for me when I try to kind of establish sort of a naturalistic framework as the starting place for like a metamodern spirituality that isn't to just totally foreclose on anomalous
Hmm.
information, et cetera. Like I actually bake into the account that our paradigms are incomplete and science is continually unfolding and leading to new information about reality. So I anticipate and expect that we don't have the full current picture, and some things that we currently might hold as again, anomalous will eventually be folded into that naturalistic framework, I think. But for me, it's very important that at least our kind of current best understanding of reality serve as our sort of shared place to begin with. And I'll get into
Right.
this maybe a little bit in a minute, but for me, it's so important to like try to attempt a spiritual conception of reality that takes our current understanding of it seriously and just works with that and tries to find an orientation towards existence within our best understanding of cosmology and science as inherently meaningful and as inherently sort of spiritual. And that to me again is sort of just it's a starting place that if we can do that, then we can start to maybe consider these other things. But if we can't do that, then we're sort of maybe more deluding ourselves and taking these kind of more mythical notions, let's say, at face value in a way that I can find might be, I don't know, not the most salutary. But that was one of the things that I wanted to ask you about. So, using a word like spirituality, some people I feel like would say, well, wait, what does this even mean? Secular spirituality, isn't that an oxymoron? As you say, I mean, there's the word spirit in spirituality. So, what does a spirituality without spirits look like? Speak a little bit about what you mean by the term spirituality and sort of what that encompasses in your framework.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to kind of how much our culture like struggles to even talk about these things, like how much our vocabulary and our concepts are dominated by whether it's some kind of like a new age spirituality or traditional religions, that even a word like we struggle to find words to describe this. Um, and people have different associations with these words. But like, without getting into etymology and that kind of thing about the word spirituality, like in general, it call it what you want. Like, what do people mean when they talk about like a spiritual approach to life, right? In some sense, it is recognizing that your life is something more than what you commonly think of it as, and something more significant than you commonly think of it as. Now, whether that's because you're actually, a child of God, and in this theistic framework, or because you are a remarkably complex energy being made of the same energy as the rest of the 4 billion-year-old cosmos that is all space and time, and like in some sense, it's more than your everyday common. I need to go to the laundromat today sort of way of
Mm,
understanding yourself, where like we have this, our normal psychology is this kind of soap opera lives that we all have, where we're the characters in a drama, and we have this common sense way of understanding ourselves that just isn't the full picture. And so
mm,
even just taking what we know good with good certainty, maybe certainty is the wrong word, but with good confidence
mhm,
from science, like it is certainly true that our lives are always much more than we commonly think of them as. And
Mm,
so when you take that larger view of being a part of a whole, like, if you need to, if because you live in a time where nobody even knows the facts of cosmology and
mhm,
physics and biology, and that it's all one interlinked thing, um, that there's no real sense of separation within. It's just, sub regions of it organizing in a flow of energy and whatever. Even if you live in a time where that knowledge isn't available and therefore you can't understand yourself as a whole in that sense, well, then maybe you have to fabricate some story about being a part of, God's plan and da 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 da, that speaks to and gets to this thing, the connectedness that you sort of intuitively feel in the world. On some
mm,
level, we can all tell that we're not separate from the rest of everything else. We're made of the same meat as the pig that we eat today, and like we, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Like
mm.
we recognize our sort of like inseparability of our existence from the world around us and the totality of the thing. But that's a hard thing to articulate sometimes. um
Well,
but one way or
you're
another, that's the truth of our situation. And when you
right.
start looking at it with an open mind, it starts to feel spiritual, whatever you want to call it, but
Mm.
that's grander sense of yourself.
No, I think that's a good framing because it makes me think of kind of a class. You mentioned my background in religious studies, which is kind of the angle I bring to a lot of this, for good or ill. It makes me think of this classic kind of distinction of the sacred versus the mundane, or the profane. With people comparatives like Mircea Eliade and folks would talk about. But I think that that's a very good. It opens up a lot of things, right? Because and again, to go back to etymology here, I guess, right? Mundane from mundus, from the world. We have our kind of worldly concerns. We're sort of locked in our little small story, and that's sort of our natural sort of state of mind is like, I've got to do this today, and et cetera. And it's a very kind of parochial kind of framework for looking at reality. But then the sacred, which is often kind of understood as that which is set apart, that is which
Mm.
there's something different or other about it. And in some ways, it's almost defined in terms of that which is decidedly not the mundane, is this other kind of modality that we also have access to. And um and I like the way that you're framing that we can conceive of the sacred in that sense as situating ourselves in a bigger picture, in a broader totality, and one in which you're also naming kind of, there's profound interconnection, interdependence, and this sort of uh, deep sort of web of being that we are ourselves just sort of, yeah, a component of. And framing that as a sacred orientation. So let's dive into that a little bit because
Mhm.
I share a sensibility like that. And why do you think, I mean, this is kind of a profound philosophical question, so, I don't know, do with it what you will, but like, why do you think that entering a space like that where we can contextualize ourselves within this grander context, why does that produce something of value in us, do you think?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, partially it's to much more deeply appreciate what you are and the significance of what you are. Um, and I mean, significance in terms of like, and here's where like I will differ from the way that scientists often talk about this publicly, where like, we are just one organism among other organisms, and life is an accident, and this sort of and we can talk about perhaps some of the reasons why it's in the ethos of science to frame things in that way to kind of keep them from getting too high on their own supply or something. They got to stay a little sober in how they're approaching things and not get
Mm,
wrapped up in things. But if you're not having to maintain that sort of sobriety to be a scientist who is trying to ask answerable questions and make reliable progress in empirical research, you have the luxury of looking at it all and letting it make an impression on you. And what is it? How do you feel about the fact that things are as they are? And we, if you look at things plainly, as humans, we are this. We're the most. We're the best game in town, right? Like we're the most complex things. Like nothing else is doing what we're doing. If you just
mm,
even took like a geographic survey of the known cosmos, and of course, probably are other intelligent life out there, but we don't know about it yet. Like of the cosmos we know, most of it is just like noble gases like hanging around, or just fusion happening, and dust just drifting in the vacuum of space, and quantum fluctuations, and like there's just um, not a lot going on there. And I think any reasonable look at what we are as a phenomenon has to notice that like we are something special and perhaps transitional, right? Like we are, just the deer in the woods aren't talking about any of this, right? And we
Hmm.
are. Um, and we know what we're made of. We know what the cosmos is, and that's a transformational sort of a kind of a thing.
Well,
In any case, like appreciating that you are that,
mm,
and that all came about on its own, without like nobody made humanity. Like that's just what the cosmos does. Like having a real in your bones and not just conceptual and intellectual sort of like feeling and appreciation of that really grounds your existence and puts you in a context that is like, you know, profound. And I don't know any other, whether you call it divine, or what was the word you were using? Like
sacred.
sacred. It, like, you can attach these labels to them if you want to. But what is it like? That's just trying to describe like a feeling, that a connection to it that comes from letting the knowledge not be held at a distance and intellectually, but
Hmm.
if you really acknowledge that this is referring to you
Hmm.
and what you are, and letting that penetrate, then
Hmm.
you know then you get into a different feeling for things.
Yeah. So, okay, a couple things. So one thought that came up while you were saying all that is like it is interesting how scientists do use that same kind of empirical datum of the fact that we are this sort of very unique thing doing this very unusual thing in the cosmos. They use that in a very different way. They come to very conclusions about that, at least in their public kind of pronouncements about the significance of that, which is to say, oh, look at all this stuff that you think is so valuable. Well, in the grand scheme of things, it's just on a tiny little dot, and we're the only people doing it. So therefore,
Hmm.
it's not significant. But that's a philosophical claim. I don't know. Speak to why, as you said, like it'd be interesting to get into a little bit of the ethos of why the insights and the framework of the sort of scientific perspective is often articulated in a way that would sort of almost intentionally try to sap the meaning and the significance and the sacrality of our existence from the story. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I have my own sort of like guesses as to why, and we should be careful to say that we're not talking about all scientists. Like
Sure.
plenty of scientists hold what you might call some sort of a naturalistic spiritual feeling for,
Hmm.
plenty of scientists kind of like let themselves be a little more uh deeply affected, and by what they learn. And you have the Carl
Sure.
Sagans, and like,
Yeah.
plenty of scientists will wax a little more poetic about it. But I think just institutionally, my guess is that like in part institutionally it's discouraged and tapped down because historically that has led to bad research, right? You
Mm.
get into some sort of like Elan Vital sort of thing, where like you start talking about things being special and life having a special force to it or something, and um that just for the sake of doing research, I think that will tend to lead you astray. And I think, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't, like I think it's correct that I think science has, for their purposes, learned how to be more effective, and how to have a kind of collective ethos that um, corrects for error in that way. So I'm not saying the scientists should be different about that, but it's sort of like stay in your lane a little bit. Like
Mm.
like their job is to describe the factual reality of existence, of the world, of everything, as well as best they can. And then you take those facts and you kind of put together that picture, and then it's like,
Mm.
what to make of all that.
Yeah.
Sort of, it's a different role, it's a different job
Yeah.
title, right?
No, yeah. I think I think you're exactly right. And I mean, it's an interesting thing too, right? Who was it that talked about the non-overlapping magisteria of the sciences and religion?
Mm,
But I see this, I don't know, from my vantage, affecting things like intelligent design studies, where people,
mm,
basically, I think this is the biggest issue, is that once you start sort of positing this unknown and causally independent thing, let's say,
Mm.
you're no longer in the business of trying to show the causal relationships that inhere in the naturalistic frame, which is the job of scientists to do, right? And the
Mm.
fact that scientists, relatively speaking, are keep being incredibly successful in being able to do that suggests that there's going to keep being a causal mechanism that we can identify going on in reality around these things. And as soon as we just say, oh, but look at how incredible this is, it's got to be, well, I don't know, then
Mhm.
we're not doing science. And so it's frustrating actually, because I do find this split when people, even scientists, when they do bring in or try to engage the sacred or the religious in some way, it winds up veering into this kind of non-scientific, if not anti-scientific register, where it's like, look at how incredible all this is, therefore, you know, can I talk to you about our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, sort of a thing? And it's like, well, I feel like the most impactful ways of bringing those two strands together is not doing that, because then you're being sort of not, I would say, faithful to either of those two epistemological traditions in full, in any sense. You're sort of skimping in one direction or the other.
Yeah.
Anyway, those are just some reflections on that, but I think that that's true. um yeah, go on.
Part of what I like about at this point, that sort of tension between science and religion, I don't even see that anymore. And to be clear, like partially, I think part of why I've gotten to where I am with it is that like I don't have any, like I kind of left Christianity a long time ago and felt no need to carry it along with me. For a long time, I probably would have called myself an atheist. And like there's a certain like humility in the face of evidence and a certain sort of like scout mindset rather than soldier mindset. If you're familiar with Julia Galef's um, kind of framing on that, where like the scout has like this humility in the face of evidence and is just trying to discover the landscape of what's there. The soldier is defending something, right? And if you're committed to a certain kind of religious tradition or something, then you end up finding yourself in a soldier mindset where like, well, here are the
Mm,
things, here are the conclusions I have to come to. The
mm,
question is, how do I get there? And then you end up with like lawyerly thinking, where like you start from the end and you find your way, you work backwards. So you have this motivated reasoning type of a situation, and it's easy to slip into that. So I think to arrive at some truth of things, you've got to be willing to discard all of that to be willing to perhaps reach a conclusion you don't want to reach, or not the one that you would like to reach, and perhaps even be open to the possibility that things are nihilistic, which I don't think is true, but if you're too motivated to avoid that conclusion, then you're
yeah.
baking your answer into the question.
Well, this raises an interesting, and actually, this is really cool, because so I very much agree, but as you also were intimating, right, like that's also maybe not the place to inhabit all the time, like that scout
Mm-hmm.
mindset. We also need to be able to live and orient ourselves towards reality in other ways than just always sort of critically looking for answers and interrogating things, right? So I want to kind of hold that up here. But then it makes me think of how, Lena Rachel Anderson talks about this in her book Metamodernity, now Polymodernity, where we can't live in the postmodern mindset either. Like you have a form of deconstruction and critique and sort of, again, interrogation to kind of like if possible, undermine things and doubt them, all that brings up to me is that there's this interesting tension there between, on the one hand, we need the modern scientific inquiry, and we need the postmodern skepticism and critique, but we also, it seems, can't inhabit those modalities all the time and live full, rich, productive lives. It's like we need to be able to, as I say, toggle in between to those perspectives. But then we also need to be able to toggle out and just, right? And then just what? And then just something. We use the insights of those tools, of those modalities, but then we also need different kinds of orientations to life.
Yeah, and that speaks to
Yeah.
like I feel like the missing tradition that our culture lacks. And again, I think that like Stoicism and the Hellenistic philosophies were a very interesting example of a time and place when a society did have something of the sort of like missing tradition that is not science, is not religion in the modern sense that people would recognize it as now, but is something that has, if you look at its fundamental traits, and that's part of like, when I was that lighting talk you mentioned, talking about like the meta lesson of Stoicism, like um, how it approaches the project and how it even defines the project is something that has some things in common with science, has some things in common with religion, but isn't either one of those things. Has some things in common with maybe like academic philosophy, but isn't academic philosophy either. And we just don't have it in our culture. Like, at least not in any kind of like well established, well, highly visible, like I think it is re-emerging currently. Like there's actually
Mm.
quite a movement going on,
Hmm.
of which you and your podcast are a part, um of kind of rediscovering this thing we've been missing. And yeah, I think that allows you to, like you say, inhabit, maybe you learn a certain stance of skepticism or not buying into every like notion that pops in your head. um that's, you have to be a little bit vigilant to like not let erroneous ideas take root. But can you, is there a kind of like just having a, more of a scout mindset, and having that sort of inquiry that goes on, it doesn't mean that you're endlessly questioning and you
Mm.
never establish any kind of like a framework or set of sort of operating principles to move forward with, right? Yeah, you're right. Like you can't spend the whole time just in contemplation mode where you're, dismantling your own
Mm.
delusional beliefs. Like you do need to operate in the world, and there is a good framework that is a kind of like an operating system that you can go with, that is part of why it works with this too, is that it makes no claims of being total and complete and final, right? Like if you learn Stoic philosophy and you start applying it, it is within Stoic philosophy to say, you know, this is version 37 of the owner's manual to the human mind,
Hmm.
and there's
Hmm.
going to be a version 38, and we know it. We know we don't understand everything, and that's part of, it's one of our own assumptions that we go by. But to say that just because it's not the final version doesn't mean there's nothing worthwhile and valuable to say,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, so talk about that because you've been in the trenches, so to speak, of actually living this and engaging in real life communities, essentially setting them up and facilitating those kind of stoic gatherings. I mean, describe a little bit about what that entails and as you said too, like there's something about this that's filling the role of what seems to be eroding in our cultural landscape due to the decline of traditional religion. That there's something functional in these sorts of gatherings, these communities, that's fulfilling a need that those in some ways used to. So describe that a little bit. I mean, what is that need,
Hmm.
and what sort of things do Stoic communities do? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at a first pass, it's just like setting aside time to even spend on any of this stuff, right? And without it being like a philosophy cafe where you're just, discussing like abstract and intellectual
Mm.
ideas, it is more like the wisdom gym where the point of it is to apply it, and it needs to be practical, and it needs to, pertain to your actual life. And in secular, modern Western society, like if you're not going to church, what time and place do you ever spend any time on that? Like it's very common for a lot of people to never, until they're in a crisis or they're in therapy, like to never just devote any time to like that kind of, the way that people who do attend church or synagogue or whatever, they have that space and time carved out each week to, try to broaden their perspective, to try to spend time even like, trying to, steep in and assimilate notions of, honorable and better living. And um you know if we what else in your life do you spend zero time on and expect to make any progress, right? Like you don't, if you don't go to the gym, you're not going to get in shape. um and so at a first pass, it's just something to be that for people who don't get that anymore from going to church or whatever that is. But I also personally don't want to find some sort of like secular church to go to. I never really liked the church experience to begin with, and I like how these sort of gatherings tend to be very informal, non-hierarchical. It's just a bunch of fellow travelers kind of getting together to like, share notes and you know, watch talks by people who know what they're talking about on this stuff, and read the old texts, and you know, talk about science and whatever in a non in like a very kind of open inquiry sort of way,
Hmm.
right? Like it's not exclusionary. It's not like anything is totally out of bounds to talk about, right? But
Hmm.
no, there's no like fealty to any particular doctrine, or you know, right? Like it
Hmm.
is an inquiry. It's and so part of these meetings is even just sort of because we don't have this in our culture so much. Some people will come to it having, you know, read a lot of Stoicism and been at it for a few years and kind of get this sort of um, not science, not religion approach to a deep sense of connection and a deeper appreciation of the human thing that you are, and trying to do a better job of that, and being in better alignment with your nature and the cosmic nature and everything, societal nature. Um, some people will come into it understanding what that project is. Others, you know, some of the meetings are just spent helping people orient as to what this even is, right? Like in terms of this isn't a cult, this isn't a religion, this is you know,
Hmm.
um, and just sort of defining the sort of the charter, or sort of the preamble of
Hmm.
like, you know, what is it we're doing here. Um, but then it just turns into a cool conversation, right? It's amazing how much, as soon as you know, open up the topic, people have a lot to say, and have a lot of feelings about it, and everyone is more profound than you realize. And um like the need and the like, it's been amazing to me how quickly people get it,
Hmm.
and how much they're like, oh, I've been looking for something like this, right?
Hmm.
Like the pent up want and need for that kind of space and time with other people to, you know, care about things that our culture doesn't really encourage you to care about as
Yeah.
often. Yeah.
What do you what would you say? I mean, some people hearing this might be thinking, "Oh, well, that all sounds very intellectual."
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not other things that maybe people also value about more traditional religious experiences. Um, it- Speak to some of that. I mean, I often find that there's sort of a continual dialectic tension between folks in pretty much any kind of deep community, at least a community related to deep ideas around some folks are going to be all about the theory and the ideas and sort of the heady stuff, and then there'll always be this kind of contingent trying to be like, you guys are disembodied, there's no praxis here, this isn't experiential, it's not lived, it's not felt. And so there's kind of this body mind thing that's always kind of coming up. And I could see people saying something similar about, well, and they do, about the kind of project that we're both talking about a lot is sort of, oh, well, maybe that's just for intellectual people who like science and stuff and want to have philosophical conversations. But where does the rubber meet the road, so to speak, in terms of society more broadly, and all the different kind of contingents, demographics, needs out there? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, I'd say that that gets to the ways in which this is at least trying to be different from academic philosophy, or, you know, intellectual curiosities. And it is there's a tendency there to sort of like, you know, kind of correct against that. People will tend to sort of like slip into an intellectual mode in these meetings sometimes, and trying to bring it back to your actual lives, and keeping it real in that way, is something that, especially in the beginning with the group, you have to sort of work at, because people have these different sort of modes they'll slip into. But you know, there is the idea of praxis and practices is very central to what Stoic practice is about, right? Like, you know, in the Pierre Hadot sort of like sense of like um the way in which like the Hellenistic philosophies were these sort of like spiritual practices, you know, the, I don't know, the view from above, and amor fati, and like all these sort of like, you know, the Stoics were more like a more like training for a sport or something than like
Hmm.
than an academic or intellectual thing. And now there is the intellectual and academic side of it, right? Like there is sort of there is the need to um work on what critical thinking even is, and to learn about cognitive biases, and like, you know, you need there's some tools to put into your kit. um but then it very much is like, when you say practical philosophy, you mean like mental parkour. Like you need to be able to operate your life
Mm,
less foolishly
mm,
at some point, and that is very much the point. Um, One thing we've done in the group we have running here in Pittsburgh is, you know, I made the suggestion, and everyone was on board with the idea of each week at the end of, and we meet weekly just to like, there needs to be a pretty frequent cadence for this sort of thing. At the end of the meeting each week, we take time to kind of like, each person says, all right, we go around and like, all right, so we had that discussion about that aspect of whatever virtue or whatever. Like, what do you take from that? What are you going to do differently this week? Like,
mm.
is there something that you want to focus on? And it may or may not even be related to what we were talking about, right? It needs to be like something that is actually meaningful to them and something that they feel is,
Yeah.
proximal to their life. And like, that's sort of like the sort of the homework. Okay, this
Yeah.
week, if you go about the rest of this week just as if you would have otherwise, if we hadn't had this conversation, then why are we doing this, right?
Yeah.
Like, the point is to make change in your lived life day to day.
Yeah.
And then we, at the beginning of the next meeting, kind of check in, like, how did that go?
Mm.
Did you forget about it? Okay, well then try again this week or whatever.
That is a profoundly different thing than what you'll find in an academic philosophical context. I have some friends studying analytic philosophy in a PhD program, or I've known people studying philosophy, and you're not going to get that in the classroom. No, the professor, as far as I know, I've not heard that is part of the pedagogy. People are exploring analytical ideas and writing to try to deepen the sense of well, the field and all this. But even the careerist elements aside, I mean, it's largely driven by argumentation and knowing the material. But what you're talking about is like really connecting the thinking and the ideas to your life, and then asking people that and trying to get people to engage with this in a way that's not just this compartmentalized intellectual activity, but it's actually yeah. So I mean that I think is a really powerful thing too, because I'm finding so much utility in the idea of wisdom. And one of the things I've been playing with is as I've been grappling more and more with the communities that I'm a part of and the discourses I'm a part of, and the way that I see spirituality tend to drift into a particular thing that I start to become uncomfortable with, I more and more feel like wisdom encapsulates so much of the kind of orientation that particularly speaks to me, because it somehow contains all of these dynamics. It's not just
Mm-hmm.
knowledge, it's practical application as well. And that was part of why I actually wanted to have this conversation and open these things up, partly to see the different sort of ways into to these topics. But another thing, of course, that's a key part of this is this kind of secular Buddhist component, and I would assume praxis coming from meditation traditions. So I don't know, explain how does that fit into all this?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, because there's a first person side to all of this, right? And to me, that's what a kind of a secular mindfulness meditation helps you um, to make a central part of the project. And like you're saying, like pushing it back against the tendency to intellectualize things too much and operate purely in concepts. And people are prone to doing that. And meditation is, to a large degree, in my understanding of it, um, just letting that be one element among many in the conscious experience that is happening all on its own, and just noticing that in a very immediate and prior to concepts sort of a way, that in every moment we all continue to have this experience that has the shape that it has, and it from the inside, from that first person perspective. And what to make of that in terms of, I don't know, physics and our scientific understanding of the world is a whole nother conversation I'm sure we'll have sometime. But one way or another, it's clearly a part of the world. And it, regardless, it is the circumstance of your life as you know it. And you don't get to have any kind of third person, vantage point on the world. You only ever, your point of contact with reality is your conscious experience in every moment, and that's it. You
Hmm.
get nothing else. Um, you've never had a moment in your life that isn't that, right? Just almost definitionally. So like, meditation is like the provides a very good complementary practice. It's just it's one of the practices in that toolkit of practices,
Hmm.
right? Um, and I think there needs to be a there what should be in that toolkit. It probably depends on the person and where they are in their life and all of that. There's a couple dozen possible things people might kind of like integrate into that, but meditation is one of them, and probably a very central one.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of putting it. And it's interesting it's coming up for me that like one of the again profound problems and difficulties is that the spaces that do exist that in our society that touch some of this stuff is, the academy and just education context, school. Um, but that is very third person. It's about the it of reality. You don't show up in the classroom and then, you know, spend half an hour just attending to your experience of
Mm,
conscious awareness, right? That's not what we do in school. So trying to find a place in our society to do that valuable thing is hard to do because we don't have
mhm.
the context for it. And then similarly, there's a kind of second person that also seems to be largely absent from our institutional frameworks. And by that I mean like ethics and value. Um, you know, uh, Essentially we've removed value and even being able to talk about value from institutional context because we live in a pluralistic society and we don't want to say that some things are right, some things are wrong, or that I'm more right and you're more wrong, or vice versa. It becomes this real challenge to be able to engage the field of value and to talk about things like virtue in these contexts. And so what we wind up getting is this very flattened third person, orientation to reality, and we miss out on being able to explore and probe the first person and the second person. And it
Yeah.
seems like these sort of wisdom gyms and these environments are opportunities to do that.
Yeah, it gets to the sort of secularizing badly that Alain de Botton talks
Mm.
about, like where it's like, yeah, we in people who still attend traditional religious ceremonies, like we'll say we talk about value all the time, right? But the secular version of culture doesn't have it, or at least it's only in the realm of politics, and then that's just uh, a total mess these days, and probably always is. Like a lot of what this reconstituting, reestablishing, revivifying this missing tradition that we once had in the West and then kind of lost when Rome fell apart and Christianity took over. um the sort of resurgence of just we'll say Stoicism as shorthand for a cluster of related things, um is kind of reclaiming that. It is kind of saying that, like, this is a necessary part of being a human being, and the talking about value and virtue and integrity and character. you know what a notion, man. What an old-fashioned thought, like.
Mhm.
And you start looking at things this way, and you really start thinking, oh my god, if only more people, especially in the secular world, operated this way, where, like, one of the things I think the Stoics really got right was to put your character, put your integrity, your virtue on a different level from every other worthwhile thing. That, like, there's like this, that's like there's like the A level goals, and that's the only one is character. And then there's all
Mhm.
the B level goals that are money and comfort and food, and or like nice fancy food.
Mhm.
All the good things in life, good parties, like good relationships, whatever the things you want, and avoiding the opposites of those, the bad health and the ostracism and whatever the things you are, like the Stoics are saying, like, yeah, the good things are good and the bad things are bad, but they're not like, you never trade a B level thing for the A level thing.
Mhm.
Like, you never trade your integrity for money or for status or for anything else. And um that's sort of like one of the, you know is that true? Is that true in any kind of like provable objective sense? I don't know, but it's a good, like, if you need a rubric to live by, that's a good one,
Mhm.
right? And you could argue, perhaps almost in like a consequentialist sort of way, that, like, if you use that rubric, your life will tend to go better than if you
Mhm.
don't, right? And the outcomes and the consequences, you don't end up with the Elon Musks of the world who,
Mhm.
like, have all the money, and they are making some bad choices recently in how they use it.
Mm. No, I think actually, yeah. Again, when we have these conversations, my mind, splinters into all these different threads. I'd love to follow each one of these things in its own direction, but the linearity of time. Um, but but one of the things that came up for me was I'd love to go down that route and explore kind of, I guess you might call it virtue ethics or what have you, because
Yeah.
again, in kind of making this contrast, I think a lot of people, when they're like, what does this mean, secular spirituality? And what does this mean? Why would we have, what is the sacred apart from theism or God or the supernatural or, this sort of a thing, right? And part of that, I think, confusion is also wrapped up with the issue of ethics. People will say, well, if there is no God or there is no, supernatural realm, then why should anyone be moral, sort of a thing. But part
Mm.
of this is a deep tradition of exploring ethics and virtue from the perspective of, outcomes, and just living a good life, a full life, and a wise life has immediate consequences for you here. And I think that those are very dramatically different ways that people approach the topic of morality and ethics. But I don't know, briefly on that, I don't know if you had any thoughts. Again, that's a whole conversation, but
Well, and I like the way that the Stoics look at this is their ethics is very incarnate. It's very much about and it is a role ethics. It is like a virtue ethics where it's like, what does it mean to be an ethical human being versus like an ethical shark, or like that your ethics
mm,
stems from the kind of thing that you are,
mm,
and isn't some abstract, Kantian sort of kind of thing. And that just makes a lot of sense to me. It's sort of like what ship are you navigating? What ship are you steering? Well, I'm steering
mm,
a human ship. And so like they take it as like, effectively self-evident that like that human thriving and human well-being, eudaimonia, is a good thing. That's what you want, right? You want people thriving, like being the fullest expression of themselves, of the fullest, like manifesting their potential in all the ways that humans do. And like, a thriving human society with people, healthy and happy and connected with each other, and doing great things, and appreciate participating in the beauty of life, and savoring their experience. Like, if you want something more than that, or if you need to be if you need it to be proven in some way that that's good, then I don't know what to tell you. Like if we can just all agree, yeah, that's what we want, then it becomes clear. Some things lead to that, and some things don't. Now, the way it's different from I think the consequentialist sort of like ethics would say something similar in that way, like suffering versus well-being and all of that. I think the difference is that like the Stoics are very realistic about, and that kind of role ethics is realistic about any attempt to sort of compute all of the downstream consequences of anything that you do in a way of maximizing some curve is like, well, you just can't realistically do that. and
mm,
and that life is too complex and messy for that, and it's not even often in principle knowable to you what is the right thing to do in some situations if it's based purely in all of its consequences, because you
mm,
can't know all of its
sure.
consequences. And the consequences are often sort of counterintuitive, right? Like the way that the Eastern sort of philosophy gets.
Mm,
Um, so what do you do then? Well, you don't throw your hands up and say, therefore it's all fucking meaningless and just whatever, just gratify yourself. It's like, well, as long as you are acting with the well-being of others as your goal, the well-being of your society, of your family, of and you are doing your best to play your role as best you can. If there are some bad consequences out of that, and unintentionally, or then it's like you still did the right thing,
mm,
even if there was some unintended consequence you couldn't have foreseen.
yeah.
If you are fulfilling your role the best you can. And I kind of feel like, well, what else can you ask of people? And that's a
Yeah.
very clear sort of moral guidance.
Yeah, there's something a bit, maybe a lot reductionistic about kind of strictly consequentialist or definitely
Mm.
utilitarian approaches to these issues, which I think tried to do something similar of like naturalize ethics. But I like what you're saying because it also brings in sort of the inherent chaos and complexity of the moral social domain as well. Like we have a little bit of we have a little bit of a horizon that we're working in, and then beyond that, trying to trace the causal paths is essentially, impossible. It's to try to think of it in some kind of predictive, manipulative way like that. It just doesn't pan out. So we have to, it leads to certain kind of valuable heuristics that I think is more in line with how the world actually operates than trying to sort of like, again, we have the answer, we've got it, in some
Yeah.
utilitarian or consequentialist sense.
There's also a way, if you want to go on a quick tangent about how this sort of like character-based ethics is essential for human like community and interaction, and that like you will trust a person insofar as you feel like you can trust their character. And I've seen there's a book about this, and I've think called "Trying Not to Try." I've seen this a talk at the Interval in San Francisco, the Long Now thing, um, by a person making the argument that like this is the way out of like the game theory kind of prisoner's dilemma, where so everyone's going to fuck you over eventually when it's to their advantage. If everyone is purely like doing a calculation in the rational economist mode of like maximizing their own well-being, like that's a person you can't trust because the game theory is such that like eventually they're going to stab you in the back. Like a character-based ethics will sometimes be suboptimal for the person's own utility maximization function or whatever the fuck, but it means you can trust them because they will place value and your well-being above like any short-term gain that they might calculate, right? So
Yeah.
without that it turns into shark tank.
Yeah, and again, it properly situates the human in webs of relation, which is what we've always been. And then when we wind up just treating ourselves as atomistic individuals and engage in some, rational theory, and it's like, well, sometimes yes, but other times no. We're actually working for the well-being of the whole, and so a different sense of I don't know, arguments and logic apply in contexts like that. And again, I think
if that atomistic argument was right, America would be a very happy place, and there wouldn't be much depression there. I think that is a that experiment has proven that it's not the full picture, at least.
Yeah. One thought, which is probably prosaic and obvious, but it comes up to me in such a powerful way when we have these kinds of conversations, is that the maxim of know thyself, which ultimately goes back even to the pre-Socratics, I guess, or at least to the Oracle at Delphi, but still in that kind of Greek philosophical tradition, is so crucial to all of this because, again, yes, there's an intellectual component to this, but it's about how that cycles back into living a wise, full, flourishing life. And that if you don't know yourself, and if you don't know that you're a part of webs of relationship and part of a community and working in this way, and that your own self sense is sort of conditioned by all of that, and if you don't understand that you're made up of the same stuff as the rest of the cosmos, and if you don't know that you're the product of 14 billion years of complexification, et cetera, then you're going to live differently, and that's going to have a cascading effect on all the rest of the things that you do and the things that you value and how well we maintain and sustain the resources of the earth, et cetera. So it does seem to all come back to this sort of gnosis almost of a kind of cultivation of self-knowledge that is also knowledge of reality. And anyway, again, that might sound profound or it might sound prosaic, I'm not sure, but that's I think the essence of the wisdom that we're getting at here. Yeah, just say something to that. Yeah.
And that knowing yourself isn't just a conceptual feat, right?
Yeah.
Like that when you say that, and the kind of knowing of yourself that you're talking about is something that has to go deeper than just being able to recite certain facts about things, right? Like it has to affect you and penetrate you and like almost like remake your sense of yourself. And if you're not doing that work, which frankly, like we don't have the time and place in our culture to encourage people to do so, right? Like our science, like you were pointing out, like you'll never have a science professor like ask, say like, wow, doesn't that blow your mind? Like does it because that's just not the project they're involved with. But like the invitation to kind of sit with and steep in and marinate in like the reality of things and the things that like okay, if you say you believe this is true, or at least that you have some confidence that it's true, like it's kind of like saying like in the like in the room over there, in the room next door, there's like an infinite wonderland of rainbows and magic and happiness. And if you sit here in this room and say like, oh, and like you're convinced that's true, and you continue, fiddling with your, whatever you're doing, and like if you don't like if it's not, you're not letting it sink in,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
If you don't say, oh shit, let's go over there, like and so there's this sort of like, I mean, the perspectival, or I know there's like I think it's some of what like John Vervaeke gets at, and like there's like the other modes of knowing, right? There's the knowing by doing. There's the embodied,
Hmm.
and we can't escape that. It's like we've gone so far in the academic direction that we even have to point this shit out, right? Like,
Yeah.
of course, we are this sort of real time lived thing. That's all that we ever get to be. Like I like the metaphor of like car racing, like which actual car race enthusiasts would think I'm like talking about the sports ball game. But like then that, like you spend time in the pit to fuel up the car and change the tires and all of that, and,
Mm.
and, and like if you don't do that, your car is going to break down and you can't win the race,
Hmm.
right? But also the race never stops,
Mm.
right? Like it's, I like that. So you can spend time doing your practices and trying to correct for our propensity towards narrow-mindedness and selfishness, and like correct for all of the reasons of which that people aren't just by default very wise. um but spending your whole life in a monastery to try to achieve some like sublime alignment with the
Mm.
cosmos, and never leaving, never like
Hmm.
coming out and engaging with the world, is also kind of like staying in the pits the whole time, right?
Yeah.
Like the race doesn't stop, and so we are this kind of real-time thing. And you know it speaks to the predominance of academia in our culture, that like we need to be reminded that intellectual understanding isn't enough.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I mean, yeah, I mean, at best, maybe a professor or a cosmologist could say, doesn't that blow your mind? But they'll never ask you, what implications does this have for your
What does that
life?
mean to
And
you?
yeah,
How does that?
how does this
Yeah,
change you? How does this change your
yeah,
understanding of yourself, right?
yeah.
And
Because it's not their role. They shouldn't be, right?
exactly, and that's the other
But we
thing
don't
too.
have that role right
Yeah,
now.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that that's a good way of framing a lot of what this kind of project, is about. Is like, is it's also, it's not just trying to say, oh, we should make cosmologists, priests or something like that. It's like, no, no. And we shouldn't just say, oh, we need to bring in, you know, I don't know, some kind of value curriculum into the schools, because that's probably not going to go well. And
But
yeah,
maybe it needs to be a different school,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like yeah, it's not the place for public schools to do this either. But it reminds me of the way that like Jewish students go to Hebrew school, right?
Hmm.
There's this other, like, or like Sunday school, like
Hmm.
there's this other school, and the what this should mean for how we raise children is a whole other thing we could talk about.
Mm, for sure.
Because we just kind of don't do that currently. Like, what do you have, like, as a person who isn't Christian or any other religion, like what do I have to hand down to my two children, like but to have that other education
Yeah.
isn't up to like your particular parents like having it all figured out.
Mm,
Like there's some shared like curriculum that is speaking to the person's task of living their life, and not just some sort of like yeah, you get
yeah.
the point.
Wisdom schools for sure.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to touch on here, and this will bring us back, well, actually very much still related to all this, because we're we're grappling with this issue that, yeah, these things are lacking in our institutions, they're lacking in our culture more broadly, and that there is a hunger for that, because these are essential aspects of a full flourishing human life, and so people are hungry for it. Um, but then the way that people find it can also, and engage with it, can be not ideal. And so I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on what you might call the shadow elements of maybe the Stoic community. One person in the group actually recently brought up, that they were seeing a lot of engagement with Stoicism, as you were talking about. But I think that some people might feel like it kind of attracts a certain demographic, maybe predominantly men. And there's also certain elements of, this sort of, I don't know, maybe like the way that Stoicism has come to be united with people engaging the reimagination or re-engagement with issues of masculinity, and all this, of course, factoring into how this is playing out in our cultural context, in which people like Jordan Peterson, and in a much more extreme way, Andrew Tate, are are getting the attention of disaffected men in society who are hungry for a lot of the genuine value that's in these traditions, but are also kind of being sucked into interesting rabbit holes. And so I don't know, speak to some of what you see as being like the Stoicism that's getting that is sort of blowing up in popular culture, and maybe some of the darker sides to that.
Yeah, that's a good one. Like, you don't have to, it's almost impossible to go any distance in any kind of spiritual related thing before you run into people's misunderstandings and confusions and it's just the whole area is just rife with it. The new age stuff being an example of that, right? Like, but Stoicism in particular, and like I should always like put an asterisk next to it when I say it, because like as I understand it, right? And I feel like I take a fuller and more like subtle and deeper kind of understanding of it than you will often see online. So when I say just any term that we use is going to be misunderstood by people because they have their impressions of based on what they've seen. And a lot of what you will see online is that kind of like macho, not like some sort of reaction to the this crisis of masculinity that our culture seems to be going through, which I am sympathetic towards. I don't kind of experience that or understand it really. But obviously there are plenty of, I think, especially young men and old boys who are, struggling with this. And so there is a lot of, it's a, it is a philosophy because it's big and nuanced and there's a lot to it. And it's deeply psychological. There are many ways in which people can misunderstand it,
Mm-hmm.
especially if they're in a rush to just have something to cling to. If they want something simple to like, some simple life hacks or whatever, it offers those. And so in some ways it's an unfortunate like distortion and sort of degeneration of what the philosophy actually is.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it may be that like one thing I like about Stoicism is there are many inroads into it, right? Like, there are the on ramps. Like people are coming from different places and you need different on ramps for different people. And it may be that even if like that kind of Broicism, as it's often called, is, a distortion and ultimately a somewhat unfortunate philosophy, if it's what that 21-year-old dude needs for a while
Mm-hmm.
and it serves some function in their life and what's missing for them, and it at least makes them aware of, and over time when they get a little bit older they can start reading more about the entirety of the thing, well they'll realize, when they get a little bit older in their 30s or whatever, that like, well that was, but they at least are clued into like that there's
Yeah.
something worthwhile there and they can discover the rest of it in time.
Yeah.
um
Yeah. No, I mean, like everything, right? There's a developmental angle to these things, and
hmm,
one of the challenges about that, though, I could see being, because it's one of the big challenges for the traditional religions, is that people engaging with certain frameworks or paradigms or systems or religions from a more kind of simplistic and kind of uh, very in a manner that really just totally lacks nuance and has some kind of even maybe profound pathologies, can kind of ruin it for everyone, so to speak. It's like a lot of people get turned off by contemporary Christianity. Well, let's say just by Christianity, because it's associated with forms that show up in culture that are just, very uh, how would you say? I don't know. Aren't a very kind of fully mature, sophisticated engagement with the potentials of that tradition, let's say. And I think there's always that danger when things start becoming very popular that they'll get diffused in those ways that will ultimately kind of have a negative effect for the reception of these things by other people or the culture, more broadly. But again, that's a challenge for any kind of tradition. I did want to, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. Otherwise, I had this other thing I wanted to bring in here, which is I wonder what connection what value there is in traditions. Because one of the things that, I mean, certainly Stoicism itself is a very rich tradition that goes all the way back, multiple millennia. Um, but I think that another thing that people will balk at when we talk about this project that we're trying to describe and facilitate in our own lives is this feeling that somehow there's a loss of connection with existing traditions, religious traditions, right? I mean, there is this sense that that the decline of traditional religions has left this kind of vacuum or this void to fill. And so part of thought would be, well, is there stuff in the existing traditions that can be brought into this in a way that can maybe be a helpful on ramp to people? Maybe there's someone who grew up Christian or grew up Buddhist that maybe in the more traditional forms of those religions they've kind of fallen out with, but there might be sort of a way in which is there a Christian Stoicism, so to speak? How do you wrap in the existing religious traditions to this, or should they be separate?
Hmm. That's a very big question. Um, you know, in short, there are certainly things that are worthwhile from the existing traditions that shouldn't just be, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, Um, and there were reasons why people were doing those things for a long time. And this gets back to what you're saying before too, that like things tend to get sort of perverted over time, and so there needs to be this sort of like corrective thing once in a while, where like any tradition is going to tend to sort of, I don't know, to accumulate some cruft or some, go off the rails in one way or another. But like at some point, there's some inherent spirituality to things, in my opinion, that like is the reason why any of that got started in the first place. And even if it got off the rails, um, you can kind of bring it back to, what it's ultimately talking about. And um, you can look at, the ways in which some of these sort of like, mythological constructs or whatever helped people to bridge the divide between how their mind works and what it is they're trying to make connection with. Like, even for someone like me who has a very extensive science education and has spent a really long time thinking about this stuff, it can be very hard to relate to the cosmos at large, right? Like we are wired as, social primates to relate to other people. And so if you need to personify things in order to have a relationship that you can that clicks with your, social primate brain, then great, as long as you realize that's what you're doing.
Mm. Hmm.
If you think that personified fabrication, that Zeus is a real thing happening in the world as a discrete, god in some corporeal form, okay, no, this was a personification of
Hmm.
something large and amorphous, right? So,
Well, let
and
me, can I ask you a question about that? This is
mm,
interesting. So, there is in the traditions themselves, wisdom is a personified
mm,
figure, right? Sophia. And in the Jewish wisdom literature, that shows up. But also in the Christian tradition, the Logos is associated with Sophia and is sort of like there with the Father at creation and all this stuff. There's a very rich, and that gets into the Gnostic versions of Christianity in the early, millennium, all this stuff, right? So there's a very rich tradition of personifying wisdom. Do you think that there's anything that could be appreciated about doing that in a way that could be sort of this is a slippery word, but sort of trans-rational, meaning like it's not pre-rational. It's not, oh, we actually think that there's this figure named Sophia and she did this thing, whatever. But more like, as you say, because we're wired to engage reality in that way, there is also something about wisdom being real. It's not just this thing that we pretend to do because life is so dismal and so we make up stuff for ourselves. It actually has a reality that once we're aware of these dynamics in life, help guide us towards flourishing. And part of what I'm always have been very interested in is this mythopoeic element to the project. I guess what we're calling it, right? And what role that can play. I don't know. So I'm just bringing that in at a couple levels, actually, because one is the question would sort of be like, do you make any use of certain kinds of symbols or images in your relationship to your Stoic practice in a way like that? Could you see any value in personifying wisdom as such, as a kind of maybe hyper object or, transpersonal entity of some kind? And finally, because we asked the big questions here, and there's all sorts of stuff that I throw at
mm,
people, like, and then the third element to this is there's something I think also of value of bringing in the feminine, especially in the context of what we were talking about with sort of the ways that Stoicism might be seen to be currently being appropriated maybe by a kind of masculinist bro culture, right? And I could see something like that being helpful there. So that's a three-pronged question around the personification of wisdom. Go.
mm. Well, I'm very sympathetic, and it's funny speaking of like how we've kind of started from different, my science background and your like
Hmm.
liberal arts background, and we've kind of ended up in very much the same place. Like it's funny how much I've come around to being sympathetic to using that sort of thing as a tool, perhaps. Um, it's almost like in the sense of like pedagogy of like
Hmm.
how do how what works for people in terms of because psychologically, and so I'm very sympathetic to you know the deliberate and self-conscious usage of that kind of imagery if that's what works for people, as long as it's deliberate and self-conscious and that's what you're
Yeah.
doing.
Right.
um and you're not falling into again self-deception or some sort of delusion where you kind of
Hmm.
forget that like you're making this up or just using it as a proxy to something else, right?
Hmm.
um I personally don't, and I don't feel much need for it, just the way my mind works,
Hmm.
and I guess partly because I have a certain education that lets me think about things in a certain framework that like I don't need to personify things. It doesn't help me. That's just the person I am,
Hmm.
and I can see how that very much could be helpful to a lot of people. And there's a real, in this project of, our missing tradition of actually trying to enwisen our people, like that pedagogy is part of doing it artfully, right? Like it's not a one size fits all thing in terms of how to move people forward in their developmental,
Hmm.
developmentally. So it's not something that resonates with me, but if people are using it knowingly, because it does resonate with them and create some progress for them, then I think that's just skillful means.
Hmm. Yeah. Now,
But
yeah,
real
go
quick
on.
though, the feminine
Yeah.
you mentioned, like absolutely, and I think there's actually some really cool positive things happening right now in the modern Stoicism movement. Thanks a lot to the efforts of people like Brittany Polat, who has and others who have worked with her on. Uh, there is a lot of the like Stoicism is not Broicism, and there is a lot of the broader view of things that includes these sort of feminine sensibilities of care and nurture, and like they take as people's central mission to build a rational society for the flourishing of humans. That is an inherently care and nurturing oriented thing to do. And so there's been a lot of work lately in this modern stoicism conferences and such where the emphasis is on these sort of more classically feminine sort of virtues, and there's been a really good sort of like corrective rebalancing
Mhm.
of the way it's showing up in our current culture,
Mhm.
to bring back some emphasis to those sides of things.
That's very cool. I mean, and that is another one of the ways in which I feel like, even though this is drawing on deep roots and deep traditions in a philosophical lineage that goes all the way back, there's something profoundly novel about bringing this into the modern world and the affordances that, greater gender equality, for example, can bring to the broader conversation, which was just left out. If it, I mean, talk about, a kind of more broicist approach. I mean, probably in the ancient world, this would have been, I would think, largely the purview of kind of educated men in kind of classical societies with
Not
not,
exclusively,
yeah,
but sure.
sure.
Yeah.
And gosh, my classics degree is both a curse and, I'm trying to feel like I know there's this whole thing around the hetairae in ancient Greek culture where you had, basically very wise philosophical female figures engaged, but it was in the context of a very also kind of patriarchal society. But anyway, different conversation. But just to make the point that, different social contexts are providing different opportunities for more people to engage these ideas, in a profound way.
I think there are several ways in which like there are really important and meaningful ways in which our modern context can move all of this forward, right? One of them is what you were just talking about, this greater like gender equality, and we don't have slaves anymore like they did back then. There's a lot of ways in which like the sort of like cosmopolitan vision that the Stoics had back then is reaching a greater fruition now, and we can keep moving that forward. But
Mm,
another way that the modern context can really add to this is that we now do have scientific knowledge of the
mm,
world that they
hmm.
did not.
Yeah,
And like folding that into all of this, I think, is an important project for modern times to
yeah,
say like, well, they the way they talked about nature and kind of speculated about it resonates very well with what we understand about it now, but we understand it in a depth and thoroughness and
yeah.
an extent that they couldn't have possibly then. And like Um, I find that to be a very insofar as they built their kind of sense of spirituality on top of that rather
Yeah.
than in any opposition to it. I personally think there's immense potential to um, really deepen people's sense of connection to the world based purely on things that we know with some high confidence.
Yeah.
And that's a project I think we should undertake.
Definitely. That's huge. And it's also, I think that that's one of the things that's uniquely like in these wisdom traditions, there is more space and openness to bring that in than I think one finds in existing religious traditions, which are much more sort of committed to a particular, set of scriptures and mythological tales and cosmologies and, sort of phenomena like that, that can hinder trying to incorporate and integrate those kinds of scientific insights of the modern world. Whereas with philosophy, that's like, yeah, more, bring it on, and the more we
Yeah.
can incorporate that, the better. So I think that there's a particularly there's a unique kind of strength in that tradition to do that. Um, we'll have to leave it there, but I want to continue the conversation and specifically around the institution building that we're talking about, the side of this project where it really is about bringing people together, forming communities, and doing this sort of missing tradition, second school thing that seems to be of great cultural need, and what that can look like, what people like yourself are already doing to further that, what like a bigger instantiation of that would look like, as well as a million other things which came up, which I'd love to get into, the nature of the subjective self and
Yeah.
how, praxis brings in all that. So why don't
Yep.
we continue this
For
in
next time.
another episode? But for now, thank you so much, Patrick. Really appreciate it taking the
Yeah,
time.
this has been great.